Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the Waves Abbey Road Saturator. The Waves Abbey Road Saturator is an emulation of a series of different things, basically two primary things from Abbey Road Studios going back to the 60s. One is a Compander unit. Compander is a compressor expander unit, primarily designed for noise reduction and tape machines. So this is one of the earliest noise reduction systems. The most famous other ones being Dolby, with Dolby A and Dolby SR, which came, I think, later in the 80s. And DBX had a noise reduction system that also had some popularity in the 70s and became a sort of a signature sound for a lot of the disco era records and Motown records, the mastering that was used there. A little bit notoriously kind of pumping and breathing kind of thing that happened with the DBX. The Abbey Road is actually quite good, and part of what they did, or part of the process, if you could imagine it, and getting past some of the ratio things. What we have here is a ratio, I think that's like 2-to-1 initially when you start. Essentially what happens with the compressors, you compress the incoming signal full frequency or full level spectrum by 2-to-1. So instead of, say, having 60 dB of dynamic range, you have 30 dB of dynamic range, just for example. And then on the opposite end, what you would do is you would expand it by 1-to-2, so it drops back down to 60 dB of dynamic range. And if everything lines up perfectly, it can sound relatively pretty transparent. The idea is that when you record it onto the tape compressed, the tape hiss will appear on playback, and then when you expand it, the tape hiss would go down about 30 dB or so. That's the basic principle of it. So I don't know all the exact numbers with the Abbey Road system, but that's the basic idea of the Compander. So that's the primary component, and you'll see that right here of the emulation, of this particular emulation. Now, the way people use this was essentially to, or they found a way to use the front end of it, because part of the process was also adding high frequency in the recording process and then taking it away on the back end. So what you would get is this thing where you record in compressed signal, high frequencies added in, and then if you just take that without taking the signal that has been expanded back out with the high frequencies taken back away, then what you get is this exaggerated, what amounts to what people would do with some kind of harmonic exciter type of effect. And this was used a lot for vocals and things like that, for adding air and stuff. So this is something that people used later with Dolby A, using just the first end of it. This gives you the full emulation, though, end to end. Gives you some additional controls like the ratio, phase inversion, all of that sort of stuff. And we'll go over some of the filters and everything. The second part of the saturation is the console that it feeds into. So what we have here on this end is feeding into a console, which is either the TG12345, which is a solid state console. This particular one, they talk about it from 1969, although I believe the first TG console was in the mid-60s, like around 65 or so. I could be wrong about that. And the red console. The red console was the tube consoles that was the predecessor or prior to the TG series console. So this was a tube-based console. The TGs were designed to be modular, so you could pull cassettes out to replace them for easier maintenance, and they were also much bigger to accommodate increasing track counts and multi-track recording. The red consoles were smaller in size, accommodating smaller track numbers, and had a warmer, richer sound. So essentially what you have is solid-state distortion, tube distortion, and then you could turn the saturator off, so you have the ability to bypass that altogether. So let's go over a quick overview of the overall unit itself. To start off with, you have an input and output control. What you'll see here is the light. If you're familiar with some of the Waves plugins, especially the Signature series, some of the plugins will give you a multicolored LED here that will light up either green, yellow, or red. And if you're in the green or yellow, then basically you're getting good basic level for processing. If you're in the red, then you're oversaturating the input. Sometimes that's an effective way to use it. There are two components. You could do a mono or stereo unit. So if you have the stereo unit, then you could actually assign the saturation to just the mid signal, just the side signal, or to the full stereo signal. If you choose mid or side, then you have a separate independent gain control of the input for that signal for saturation. So you could drive more level in for heavier saturation if that's what you wanted for the mid signal, and then adjust at the output. So that just gives you the ability. We'll operate this in stereo, just kind of go through a few of the settings. Now, as part of the process, essentially we have a signal flow left to right. We have a pre-EQ, so this is allowing you to add or bring in equalization into the signal that feeds into the compander. With the compander, essentially what you have is a ratio control, which allows you to control how aggressive the compander process is in terms of its distortion characteristics. You have a blend, which is essentially like a wet-dry control, more or less. Oops, be careful about that. And then we have high-pass and low-pass filters that allow you to kind of target where the processing occurs, right? So you can shut this off, or you can target it within specific frequency zones, and you kind of see the filtering spectrum right here. Once you get through this, then you go on to the saturator here. This is the console that it plugs into. So you either have the TG, or the red console, and then essentially when you put this in, you have this gain knob which determines how heavily saturated you want the signal to be. So if you start with 0, you're getting a minimum, or basically almost no effect. If you're in the middle, you're getting like a good harmonic distortion, but not overly distorted. And as you push up here, and of course it depends on the input level, you'll get more heavy saturation. So if you really want to very aggressively attack something, you could do it that way. At the output, you have a post EQ, because what you can do here is you can use the pre-EQ as a way of shaping or focusing in particular frequency zones that you want to saturate more heavily. It'll go through the process here of saturation, and you could use the EQ on the back end, an identical EQ, to sort of mirror image what it is you're doing on the input. So if you take away high frequencies here, you can add high frequencies back here. If you take away low frequencies here, you can add the low frequencies back here. That's the basic idea of it. And then you have a mid-band parametric. Okay, so what you have just with the EQ, just so you understand what the frequencies, you have a low shelf. It's a little bit backwards here. You have high shelf here, which will give you the pre-EQ at 2,550 hertz. I don't know. It's like 2.55 kilohertz, I guess, is where we're at there. This one, we have a frequency range from 40 up to 10K. So you got plenty of range there. And then you have a high frequency shelf, or low frequency shelf, set at 200 hertz. And you get a pretty broad range, plus minus 36 dB here, plus minus 18 here on the mid band, and it's identical on the out. You can just take it in or out of the circuit, okay? But that's basically your processing. So essentially, the way that I found best to kind of work with this, if you're not familiar with it, is to start with an input signal. I'm just going to bring in some drums here, and then I'll isolate a few individual instruments just so you how you can kind of play around with it. But more or less to give you an idea, what we're going to start with, I'm just going to bypass it so we can hear just a little bit of signal, and then we'll go in and we'll work with the components one by one. I'm going to turn the saturator off here for a second. All right, so that's unprocessed. So now I'm just running through the components here. Now we're really just going to run through the Compander circuit here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set an input gain level to get myself in the green / yellow orange here. All right, so it looks like we're in a pretty good range just right there. And now I'm going to work with the compression expansion circuit. So I don't have filter settings in terms of we know the frequencies here. You just have these different frequency selections. I don't know how steep or sharp the filters are, but it basically more or less gives you crossover points to determine where the compander is working, right? So if I set it here, it's operating full frequency, right? So if I take this, then I can change the blend here if I want to mix it in. So this would be dry, excuse me. right? So I have a nice saturation there that I can work with. So if I want to eliminate this, I could just take this and just pull it all the way down, right? So I'm just going to scroll so I don't move the screen around. So I could work with it that way. On this end, we have the saturator. So if I work, say I want to warm up the sound, I'll probably go with the red for warming it up. Let's just hear a little bit of this. Right, so that'll give me like a warmer saturation. If I want to go to the TG, let's just reset this back to normal here. I could do something that's a little bit more aggressive, right? Right, so you get an idea there of like, just the different types of distortion here that I can work with. So I can kind of blend any of those characteristics, including this. So let me just pull this back for a second or turn this off. Maybe that's the better way to do it. Kind of work with the compander a little bit here for a second. And let's just kind of see what happens here when you start to focus it within particular frequency ranges. So when you start to filter this, it'll focus the processing within different bands. Or different areas. So if I start to cut off low frequencies, it'll allow that to kind of pass through unprocessed and process signals above, and the same on the top end, right? And then I can kind of blend that in. So the idea here is that I can sort of target or focus where I want the processing to be. Now, if I want, I can actually also do some things here where, let me put the EQ on here, where I can have it, it'll just leave it here full frequency and just have it target like a more specific frequency here. So it's less or it's more subtle, much more subtle going into the compander than it is into the saturator, because this also feeds into the saturator. When you start working with this and you start including the saturator in here, then this will get much more aggressive. So it allows you to really target how much you want this. So in other words, this gives you a more subtle tonal shaping going in, and then you have the filters to kind of work around that with the sound. So if I start to filter these off, it'll allow the dry signal will pass through or go through to the saturator, and so it sort of compounds on itself, I guess is basically what I'm saying here. All right, so this allows you just to shape essentially what's going on. Now we could also do the same thing here with this. So let me just take it here, zero the gains out here, and let's kind of work with this. Just take this away for a second. So I could also do this here where I take a little bit of this away here so it doesn't do the low end, and then put it back over here so kind of keep a little bit less processed by the distortion. I'm sorry, that's working with the Compander here. Oh, I got this out. Here we go. Here. And then obviously, I set the gain back. But you see here with the EQs how you can sort of shape with the EQ exactly what it is that you're running through the saturator or the Compander, the blend of them both, and then you can sort of mangle and distort and kind of create things on your own. So when you start to apply this to individual instruments, you have the same basic control. So if it's a kick drum, you obviously can target your frequencies. I'm just showing here a drum kit because I can demonstrate a bunch of different things. You can work with vocals, you can work with bass, pretty much guitars, anything that you want to just saturate and kind of mess around with. It's a very powerful tool. But understanding what the two different things, you're going to get more subtle type of more pumping and breathing sort of compression here with the Compander, a little bit more of an exciter kind of an effect. With the Saturator, you're getting more, solid saturation. I think this is really great. I think it's amazing is the fact that there is, little to no aliasing that I can make out in terms of the processing, which is always a big part with the distortion things. Incredibly well done. Really love this as a valuable tool just for getting some kind of vintage distortion that has some flexibility to it without a lot of artifact or any artifact at all. So really good work. Waves always does make some great stuff, and this is just another one onto the vast pile of really cool things. So there you have it. Mixing with my plugin of the week, Waves Abbey Road Saturator.